don't eat too many calories, eat enough protein and fiber, limit drinking. I say limit because, drinking is a big part of our culture. And if you can abstain, great. Don't smoke, get enough sleep, and take care of your mental health like we were just talking about. You do those 6 things, you're way ahead of the game.
Welcome to Longevity by Design, a podcast designed to give individuals access to the leading scientific information in the field of longevity. The ability to add years to your life and life to your years needs no opinion. Join us as we ask science to take the wheel. In each episode, Dr. Gil Blander joins a co-host and an industry expert in the field of longevity, shining a light and getting the answers to the key question: how can we live a longer, healthier life?
Hello, I'm Dr. Gil Blander. Welcome to Longevity by Design, how to live longer, healthier life. We are produced by Inside Tracker, your science-based guide to optimize your body from the inside out. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Layne Norton, the founder of BioLayne and the Carbon app, to the podcast. Layne is an accomplished scientist, educator, and a voice of reason in the often chaotic world of nutrition and fitness. Layne earned his PhD in nutrition science from the University of Illinois, where he research focused on muscle protein metabolism. And he also completed his undergraduate study in biochemistry at Eckerd College. He has authored over 10 peer-reviewed scientific publications and is widely recognized for bringing the gap between rigorous science and real-world application. Through his work as a speaker, coach, and content creator, Layne continued to educate and challenge both the fitness industry and everyday individuals with evidence-based insight. Layne, welcome to the show. I'm excited to have you with us.
Thanks, Gil. Appreciate you having me on.
Excellent. So I would like to start with a bit about your background and basically the scientific foundation and learn about a bit about your personal journey. So you received a PhD in nutrition science from the University of Illinois, which I actually really like. I'm a part of their scientific advisory board for personal nutrition. So I visited there a few times, and I think that it's one of the best universities in nutrition. So I'm very excited to hear a bit about from you. And so I would like to know how the experience at the University of Illinois shape your unique approach to evidence-based nutrition and fitness.
Well, I think when I look back at my life, there's so many forks in the road where I went one way when I could have gone another way and just got really lucky. When I started looking for graduate schools, I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. This is back in 2003 when I was a junior in college or third year in college. And I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I knew I wanted to be in fitness, but I didn't know how to make money there. And so I figured, well, I'll go to graduate school and delay the real world by a few years. And that was really my plan. And so I knew I wanted to study protein and nutrition, but at the time, it wasn't, now you can just Google whatever, in terms of like best universities for certain things or whatnot. The internet was still very young back then. So I started going to different websites and different major universities and looking for to find somebody who was studying what I was interested in, because I did get some good advice from a former Vice President B. Johnson, who just happened to be my godfather. And he said, pick the advisor, don't pick the university. Find an advisor who's studying what you want to study. He said, because if you pick based on the university and you get an advisor who's not studying what you want to study, now you're going to have to convince him why what you want to study is more important than what he wants to study. So that was actually really, really great advice. And I remember going to PubMed, which was very new at the time, and typing in leucine skeletal muscle protein synthesis. I still remember that. And the second paper that came up was from Don Layman at University of Illinois. And I interviewed with him. I interviewed with Scott Kimball and Leonard Jefferson at Penn State. I reached out to Kevin Tipton, who was at Texas at the time. And these were all top researchers in protein metabolism. And a few of them were taking graduate students. Layman was, Jefferson was too. And I scheduled to go to University of Illinois and visit. I met with Dr. Layman, and I could just remember my dad went with me and actually sat in on the interview. And Layman was just so friendly and open, and he was totally cool with my dad being there. And really, it just turned into a session where I was kind of quizzing him. Like, I was so into this stuff. I was so interested. And he was just blowing my mind with some of the things he was saying. And just so many things I had never considered. And I just knew that was where I was going to go. I loved meeting Layman. He was so unique in that he had the same background as me in undergraduate in biochemistry and then went to nutrition in graduate school. And he liked that I had that background too, because I'm sure you know this, Gil, a lot of biochemists, they can zoom in on the blades of grass and get really focused on the blades of grass. And nutritionists are looking at the entire forest. But sometimes they don't understand how the blades of grass impact the entire forest.
Yeah.
And Layman understood how the blades of grass impacted the forest. So he had a deep understanding of the biochemical pathways, but also understood what that meant on a holistic, high-level view. And there just aren't that many people out there like that. So I just happened to get really lucky that Layman was a great advisor. And again, I got some great advice when I went to interview with him. My godfather said, ask the students in his lab, what's the best thing about working for him? What's the worst thing about working for him? He said, because there are really bad graduate school advisors out there who you are either cheap labor, they don't care if you graduate. So I asked, the students, and they said, listen, he's great. He's unbelievably smart. He's a great advisor. He's a great mentor. But if you are not a self-motivated person, you're going to struggle because he's not going to hold your hand. If you have questions, he'll answer your questions and he'll help you as much as you want, but he's not going to be holding your hand, micromanaging you. So, and he's gone a lot because he gets invited to a lot of speaking events. But yeah, I went there. It was a great experience. I learned so much. I always tell people the most I ever learned was just sitting in lab meetings, talking about research papers, tossing around ideas for studies, poking holes in our ideas, poking holes in other papers. That's, I think, where I get a lot of my critical analysis from, is just being involved in those conversations and really understanding, one of the things that was impacted on us that really stuck with me. One, we were okay with being wrong. That was a huge thing. Two, we were okay with being controversial. That was fine. Yeah. And three, I came to understand, I don't know if you ever directly said this, but I came to understand that getting the right answer is actually about asking the right question. A lot of people, they want an answer to a question, but they don't even ask the right question. And if you don't ask the right question, and you don't understand how to get the answer, which is all about research design, you have to be able to understand how to design a study to answer the specific question you want to answer. And I see so many studies where I look at the conclusion and then I go to the methods and I go to the results and I go, you didn't actually answer your question. This is a different answer. Your own data doesn't support your conclusion. And, that goes to having a proper control groups, proper time periods, proper exposures. These things all matter. And a lot of times people will say, well, do you really think you need a PhD to do this stuff? And I said, no, I think you could teach yourself to do this, to read, interpret research. But by the time you get good at it, you probably should have just done a PhD anyway, because it'll take you that long. So yeah, the University of Illinois was great. And it's funny, I'll get some people sometimes who will say, oh, well, your PhD's from Illinois. I like that's a bad thing. And I'll say, have you ever bothered to look up where Illinois ranks on just overall public universities? It's perennially in the, outside of the Ivy League schools, when the sciences, it's perennially up there in the top 20. And then specifically for nutritional sciences, it's usually top 5. And I think when I was there, it was ranked number 2. So It was a great school. I got a great education. I was very, very fortunate.
Yeah, and I'm looking now, there is the nutrition conference in Orlando at the end of the month, and I looked at the abstract and the presentation, and I would say there is a very high attendance from the Illinois scientists. So again, showing how good is Illinois in the nutrition field. I completely agree with you. And I like your approach of don't select the university. It doesn't matter if it's Harvard or MIT or Illinois. What is important is do what you like and research it and enjoy it, because it's like in everything in life. You cannot do something that you don't like because you won't do it well. You should be fascinated about what you're doing. So I really like your approach.
Yeah, Layman said you got to pick something that you're enthusiastic to study, because your enthusiasm level at some point will be half of what it originally was. So you want to make sure that it's 100% when you started.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. So what motivated you later to become more like a scientific communicator, like what you're doing today, and not staying in the academia and being a professor, for example?
Yeah, I felt like I knew I wasn't going to be a professor. I am not a very well organized person, as weird as that may seem to people who, follow me. A lot of people will think I'm like this type A, super regimented, and that's not it at all. I'm very much more creative on the creative side of things. Really, there was no plan. There was, like I said, I just kind of fell into what I was doing, even with coaching and with content creation. I started out, I was posting on the bodybuilding.com forums and some other bodybuilding forums back in the early 2000s. And as I learned more, I just saw that there was so much dogma out there, so many things that just blatantly weren't true. So saying, we're okay with being wrong and getting being wrong repeatedly in graduate school, I was just okay with challenging everything. When I got to the point where my initial kind of thought when somebody made a claim was, I wonder if that's BS, and then I would go look up research studies on it and often debate people online about it. And so my first bodybuilding coach, who has a PhD in nutrition, he goes, Layne wakes up gritting his teeth wanting to punch someone in this for false claims, So yeah, I kind of thought of that when social media came around. People were sharing so much content online, so much of which I think I read in a study actually that showed up to 87% of fitness claims in the online space are false. And so, I saw what was happening, and it never started out super regimented. I just started, it was kind of like whack-a-mole. Something came up, I debunk it. Either it was Instagram, Facebook, whatever, Twitter. I was on Twitter a lot, and then I'd move on to the next thing. And probably, I would say around 2018 or 2017, I hired my first person to video me. Before, I just did it all myself. Hired my first person to video and edit me. We did some educational videos. We did some debunks. It wasn't structured. And then in 2018, I got a new video guy who was like, hey, let's make a series on YouTube. Let's start doing series, okay? And so I would do an educational video, and then I would do a debunk video each week. And that kind of turned into a very, regimented thing. I guess I've been doing for almost 7 years now. And, I enjoy educating people. I also enjoy, debunking nonsense. And, I have had some, it's funny, I'll get like one of two responses in the scientific community from my colleagues. The first one will be kind of like the highbrow, this debunk stuff is below you. This isn't how scientists talk, like that kind of stuff. And then the other half of scientists are messaging me on Twitter privately going, oh my God, thank you for doing this. I want to say exactly the stuff you say. I just can't say it because I'm at a university, right? And so, I just kind of got more regimented with it. Then we would, originally that was all for YouTube, but then we started cutting it out to share across platforms, with shorter versions for Instagram and TikTok when it came around. And now, I guess I can kind of talk about this now because we started filming. I'm going to actually be bringing out my own podcast where I'm going to bring a lot of that shorter form content into longer form with education, with debunks, having guests, that sort of thing, because I do feel like my long form stuff is my best stuff. And so, I think a podcast for me has made a lot of sense. I've just, had a lot going on in my life. So I kind of put off starting it, but we've already started filming some episodes and that'll be coming out soon. So, there was no plan around it, but, it turns out I think I'm pretty good at that stuff. And I think my unique intersection that's allowed me to have some success is that I understand the science, the research science. And oh, by the way, some of the research science I don't understand. And when I started looking more at cardiovascular disease stuff, there was a lot of stuff I didn't understand because even though I'm a PhD in nutrition, if you know the skill, if you're not in that specific area, it can still be something you don't really understand that well. Yeah. So I reached out to people who understood that world better, who could point me in a direction of research reviews to read so I could get up to speed on that stuff. And so I've got no problem admitting when I'm a little bit out of my depth and getting some help on it. So, I think my unique role is that I'm enthusiastic. I can educate, I can entertain, I can add some comedy and some flavor to it, make it not so boring. But the one thing that I picked up from Dr. Layman that was so huge for me was that he was great. I mean, I've never met anybody better at simplifying things without losing the nuance of it. So being able to generalize while still sticking true to the science. And as you know, that is a very, very difficult thing to do. And I'll never forget when I was getting my PhD exit seminar, my mom had driven up to watch it. And I asked Dr. Layman, I said, how do I tailor this talk? My mom's going to be in the audience. There's professors in the audience. And he goes, your mom should learn something from this talk, and I should learn something from this talk. And that really stuck with me. And so I've always kind of tried to keep that core theme of, I'm going to make sure that everyone walks away with something, even people who are very highly educated and even people who are complete neophytes.
Yeah, and I call it know your audience. You cannot talk for a bunch of PhDs like you talk to people that are not PhD. But if you have both, you need, as you said, to do both. And I completely agree with you. And it's really worrisome me how there are so many wrong things that running in the internet right now and making people really confused. We are really in confused time right now. Everyone have his own mantra. And finding one paper, and I can find a paper that supporting everything that I want to say. And then they're taking that paper and making him a full word. And that's really bad because people are getting the wrong impression. And I'm very happy that you are starting your own podcast because hopefully people will receive the right message and the real science. We need to follow the science, not what a specific guru want to say. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, the one thing I think I'll point out with simply in regards to that, yeah, you can always find an isolated research study to support whatever narrative you want. Like, it may not say exactly what you want, but again, people aren't equipped to like look at the research and say, oh, well, that's a rodent study that's looking at a surrogate marker in these genetic knockout mice. But it supports what you say, right? No, not really. And cherry picking is another big thing too. I mean, I'll use this example all the time. I remember pulling up a meta-analysis of the risk of adenocarcinoma from smoking, right? And looking at a forest plot. For those out there who aren't familiar with the forest plot, you have a center line, which basically means no effects, no effective treatment. And then you have, on this particular one, to the right of the line is increased risk of lung adenocarcinoma. To the left is decreased risk. And the dots will appear from each study further or closer to the line, depending on how much risk that study showed from the particular treatment, in this case, smoking. Well, there was about 50 studies, and if you look to the right of the line, most of them were to the far right of the line, but there were 2 studies that were a little bit to the left of the line. Now, I could pick out those 2 studies and say, well, see, smoking doesn't cause cancer, but without disclosing that the overall effect, based on the summation of the data of these studies, was a 700% increased risk in adenocarcinoma. Isn't that the take-home story,
Yes. Yeah. You remind me a funny story. As you know, I'm really fascinated about longevity. So there is a very smart scientist. His name is Nir Barzilai. He's following a centenarian. He has 600 centenarian in the family that are looking at them. And his famous story is he's coming to a house of a 105 years old centenarian, and she's smoking. And he's telling her, Miss X, don't you know that smoking is not good for your health? And she is replying to him and saying, the 4 clinicians that used to treat me told me that I shouldn't smoke, but all of them are dead.
Yeah, we call that.
So you can always find the reason why to smoke, but we know that it's not healthy.
Well, and this is a great example of, 1, survivorship bias. And then 2, people don't understand the concept of risk. Okay, everything is a risk analysis. There is nothing out there with absolute 100% certainty. If you do this, it will cause this. That doesn't exist. Now, there are things that can drastically increase your risk. For example, if you're genetically have that polymorphism for the BRCA gene, it is very, very likely you're going to get breast cancer. Very likely. But not everyone gets it because the outcomes, physiological outcomes, are summations of not just one mechanism, they're summations of thousands of biochemical pathways. What matters is the overall effect. And so, yes, listen, so if you smoke, it drastically increases your risk, but it doesn't mean that you're absolutely going to get lung cancer or cardiovascular disease. It doesn't mean that. And, but what I will say is this, you can point out this lady and say, well, this lady lived 104. She smoked every day. Okay. Well, all things being equal, if she hadn't smoked, she'd probably be even more healthier and live even longer. Right. So that is the take home, but people don't understand that. And there are people who exercise every day, who eat right, who don't smoke, who don't drink, and drop dead of a heart attack when they're 40 years old. So again, it's like, I use this example. Seatbelts, we know, save lives. Well, absolutely. We have so much data on that. But seatbelts also kill a few people every year. Every year, there are people who get killed by their seatbelt. But if you are playing the Vegas odds, you are wearing your seatbelt. If you are playing the odds. And that's, I think that's where people struggle. That's where, honestly, COVID did such a disservice to science because, and everything got so polarized. And we had people saying, the vaccine's absolutely safe. There's no side effects whatsoever. And I think if we're being honest, we can say, no, some people get myocarditis and there's some serious side effects for some people. But again, if you're doing the math, if you're doing the odds, if you're in a higher risk population, you're getting vaccinated. But that's a hard conversation to have if people don't understand the basic concept of how risk works.
Exactly. And I think that you raise a very good point about the extreme. So the example of this 105 years old centenarian, she's lucky. She has the great genes. And in the other side, the guy that is running every day and is lean and eat well, he has a bad genes. But most of us, 99.9% of us, are somewhere in between. So we can control, and there is a lot of data that suggests around 80% of our future controlled by our lifestyle, nutrition, exercise, and so on. So 80% versus 20%. Think about it like that, and work on the 80%. You have so much to gain by living a healthier life, and somehow people don't understand it.
Absolutely, and again, the person who dropped dead of a heart attack at age 40. They probably would have dropped dead even earlier if they hadn't been doing all that stuff, right? So that's something you got to understand is I think genetics are going to kind of set your ceiling and your floor, right? Like there's only so much mobility within your genetics.
Exactly.
But within that, there is mobility and you can modify your probabilities for living longer.
Yeah, exactly. So Layne, that was a fascinating introduction. And I would like to switch gear and discuss, I think, your favorite subject, nutrition, muscle, metabolism, and so on. So you're well known for your advocacy for a high-protein diet. What should we know regarding to latest and brightest study about it, and what is the effect on aging population that would like to preserve muscle and still be functional at their 80s and 90s? What should they do?
Yeah, so when I say high protein diet, that means different things to different people. So if we look at in the USA, the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So if you're a 80 kilogram person, you're looking at about 64 grams of protein per day. Okay. Most Americans consume more than that. Now, a high protein diet, I would consider above 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. So for for an average size person, you're looking like, 120, 130 grams or more. I'm painting with a broad brush. To me, growing up in bodybuilding, a high protein diet is, 3 grams per kilogram of body weight. So, but I think for the regular population, like 1.6 grams per kilogram is what's considered a high protein diet. And protein has kind of had this negative connotation over the years. There's been a lot of hand-wringing about kidney function, liver function, heart disease. And part of the problem with nutritional studies, and again, I'm not trying to, poo-poo nutritional studies because I very rarely say something's a good or a bad study. I just say, it's more or less applicable based on how well designed it is and the population and how many people there are and so on and so forth. But when you're looking at long-term outcomes, like say longevity, how long people live, or you're looking at cardiovascular disease or cancer, well, we can't really, it's hard to do human randomized control trials to look at those endpoints because you got to wait for people to die or have heart attacks or get cancer. And those are diseases that develop over the course of years and decades. And so even if you do a 5-year randomized control trial, which by the way, there's not many people who can run a 5-year randomized control trial. I would consider 2 years a very long randomized control trial.
Yeah.
Even if some people can get some differences or people die, well, it's not saying anything about the 5 years before that trial. It's very hard to pick apart. And so what we're kind of left with is cohort data. Now, people may, if you don't understand the difference between randomized control trials and cohort data, with cohort data, there is no treatment, right? We're not telling anyone what to do. What we're doing is we're tracking people over a long period of time and looking at their lifestyle, their habits, their intakes, and then attempting to associate those with outcomes. In this case, we're talking about cardiovascular disease, cancer, longevity. And it can really be messy because when you're doing that sort of thing, yes, you can make associations and you can try to control for confounding variables by doing statistical corrections. But you can't covariate out 30 confounding variables. Like it's just not possible. So it can be very difficult to say, okay, well, this was associated with this, but there are a lot of moderating effects, right? Like for example, if we look at the intake of ultra-processed food and cardiovascular disease, cancer, whatnot, you're going to see an association there. But is that because of something to do with the processing, or is that because people who eat a lot of ultra-processed foods are going to have more body fat, they're going to consume more calories, they're going to have poor overall nutritional intake, less fiber? It's hard to disentangle all those confounding variables. The reason randomized control trials are considered kind of the gold standard research is because they remove a lot of that bias. Because instead of allowing people to self-select what group they fall into, you are randomly allotting them to different groups. Now, why is people miss out on the fact that the randomization, randomized, that is the most important part of a randomized control trial? Because when you randomize people, what you are doing is you are acknowledging that people have different baseline characteristics and different inherent characteristics. But since you are randomly allotting them to groups, you can assume that those characteristics are randomly distributed throughout the groups. And so any difference in the outcomes you see are probably due to the treatment rather than some inherent bias. I mean, I remember when Paul Saladino was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I remember shaking my head because I'm like, this guy doesn't understand how randomized control trials work, because they were talking about a study on intermittent fasting that showed people on intermittent fasting. I can't remember the outcome they were looking at, but I think they lost more lean mass than people who were not doing intermittent fasting, doing a regular diet. And Paul's response was, well, how do we know that the group doing intermittent fasting was just not eating a bunch of junk food? Well, because it was randomized. And by the way, if they were eating more junk food, you could actually argue that, okay, well, if you do intermittent fasting, that makes you eat junk food then, if these correlations are correct. So the randomization is very important for those sorts of things. Now, again, I think people have this impression that research subjects just sit around twiddling their thumbs, waiting for professors to say, we want to test something, and they go, okay, I'm ready now. No, people who are in research trials are people like you, me, people watching. They're regular people who have regular lives and regular jobs. And you're going to let somebody control what you eat for 2 years? Most people aren't going to volunteer for this. And if they are, they're going to get compensation. They're going to want to get paid. And so when people ask me, well, why wasn't a study longer? Why didn't it do more subjects? Why was it more tightly controlled? Money, money, and money. Because you have to pay these subjects, and these analysis cost money.
Yeah.
So anyways,
and another point is also, you have been a graduate student, I've been a graduate student. The graduate studies time is around, let's say, 5 years.
Right.
So the graduate student doesn't want to extend it. So there are a lot of confounding issues that it's very hard to go longer. And especially in nutrition, there is not like a incentive for the nutrition company to pour billions of dollars to do a study. It's not like the pharmaceutical company
Correct.
that they will develop a drug and then it will be blockbuster. So the fund for nutrition studies is much more limited, and that's a big problem.
As a Longevity by Design podcast listener, you understand the value of improving your health for today and for all the years ahead. And if you want to live your healthiest, longest life possible, you need to understand what's going on inside. At Inside Tracker, we take a personalized approach to health span optimization that eliminates guesswork from your wellness plan. Inside Tracker analyzes blood biomarker and DNA data, along with physiomarker data from fitness trackers like Oura Ring, to deliver personalized food, supplement, lifestyle, and exercise recommendations that allow you to take control and improve your health span. And for a limited time, Longevity by Design listeners can get 20% off at the Inside Tracker store. So if you're ready to receive a personal health analysis and data-driven wellness plan to optimize your body for the long haul, then it's time to start inside. Visit insidetracker.com/podcast to get started today. That's insidetracker.com/podcast to get started today.
That's correct. That's correct. Very limited. So again, when I give these, I know your question was about protein, but I wanted to set the stage. When it comes to longevity, and again, Gil, to your point, you can pull out any individual studies that will support whatever narrative you want to push. And so people who are kind of against higher protein diets, the narrative around that is, well, protein increases IGF-1, and IGF-1 seems to be involved in some of the progression of some cancers. Protein also increases the stimulation of mTOR, which appears to be involved in some of these cancers. And then we can find, the effect isn't consistent, but you can find studies that associate protein intake with cancer and heart disease. Again, the problem with that is people eating higher protein diets, especially in the United States, they're not bodybuilders or fitness enthusiasts eating lean chicken breasts. People who tend to eat more protein are eating more meat, and that's also actually associated with poor diet quality, because people don't tend to, if something's being added to the diet, something else is usually being forced out. Okay, so people who eat more meat, who eat more protein, tend to eat less fiber and fruits and vegetables. And that is a huge moderating variable right there. These aren't fitness enthusiasts who are, eating a lot of lean protein and then also a lot of fiber. That's not what's happening here. And they tend to eat more calories as well because they eat more processed food. Most of the meat intake is from processed meats or processed foods. So the effect isn't consistent. And you have you've got this kind of, you're taking epidemiology, and then you're taking mechanisms and you're trying to tie them together. And the problem with that is, using that line of logic, you shouldn't eat carbohydrates or fats either, because carbohydrates increase glucose in the short term, increase insulin. Well, we know if those things are elevated long term, they can contribute to the progression of a lot of different diseases. And we can associate carbohydrate intake with negative health outcomes as well.
Yeah.
Fats, high-fat meals impede flow-mediated dilation, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And if we can associate dietary fats with negative health outcomes too. Now, it depends on the individual type of dietary fat, but we can associate those. So again, if you're going to make this argument, you've got to apply it symmetrically. And in that case, we're left with kind of like chewing on ice cubes is our foods that we can eat that appear to be safe. So what I'll tell people is, for me to see cohort data that I feel very strongly about, I really want to see the effect be very consistent across a lot of different populations, over a lot of different labs in a lot of different countries. And, a great example of this is, let's take meat intake, for example. There's a study I really love to point out, by proxy kind of controlled for diet quality. So I was looking at tertiles of meat intake. So, 3 different levels of meat intake against 3 different levels of fruit and vegetable intake, and found that there was an association with all incident cancer at a low level of fruit and vegetable intake and high meat intake. But there was no association with high meat intake and high fruit and vegetable intake. Why? Because if you're eating a lot of meat and a lot of fruits and vegetables, you're probably actually eating a pretty high quality diet. There's not a lot of room for junk, right?
Yeah.
And so, to me, if meat or protein independently is a risk factor for cancer, we should see a linear increase, a dose response regardless of the intake of any other food. And we don't see that. And the effect is not consistent. You can even find a lot of studies that show no association with meat and cancer or longevity. But let's take something that I am very confident in. Dietary fiber and its effects on longevity, cardiovascular disease, cancer. I am not aware of a single study on dietary fiber that doesn't show positive outcomes for mortality, cardiovascular disease, cancer. I haven't seen one. We're talking about dozens of meta-analyses, thousands of studies over decades in multiple countries, labs, millions of subjects with a very consistent outcome that also, by the way, has a defined dose response. That's something I'm confident in.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and to add, Layne, to add to the fiber, I 100% agree with you. It's also for diabetes. So there is a lot of data that show that. So fiber, I agree. If you think about a macronutrient that other than, let's say, protein that we should consume more, and we are not consuming it mostly because what you said, instead of eating a natural food, we are going and consuming the processed food, and the processed food is usually very lean in fiber.
Yeah.
And so I agree with you. Eat a normal food that is not processed, and most likely will be okay. Again, don't eat red meat or a fat steak every day, but if you eat natural food, you should be good.
yeah, and that's the moderating variable of meat intake as well as the saturated fat intake, because saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol. And again, if we're talking about independent risk factors, LDL is a classic independent risk factor. When all other things are equal, if you increase LDL, you see an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, very consistent. And that applies for, again, if you look at, I think the Framingham study showed this, low inflammation or high inflammation, in both cases, you had a reduced risk of heart disease with lower LDL. And in both cases, you had an increased risk of heart disease with higher LDL. Now, the low inflammation, all things being equal, they had a lower risk of cardiovascular disease than the people who had high levels of inflammation. But again, even in the low inflammation group, if they had higher LDL, they still had a higher risk than people who had low LDL. So again, that's where we say, okay, that's an independent risk factor because you can change around these other variables and you still see the dose response. Yeah. So when it comes to protein, the thing that we really should, as we get older, one of the things that is really a big risk factor for mortality is sarcopenia. You won't realize this, but I think Bob Wolf published a paper back in the early 2000s where basically he was able to tie, I think something like over half of deaths after age 65 to some kind of muscle weakness or lack of muscle mass. Yeah. People say, well, how could that be? Well, if you have more muscle mass, you actually have better quality of life. You have less risk for falls. People get really focused on bone density when it comes to falls, and they miss out on the fact that if people were stronger and had better balance and better gait, they wouldn't fall as much, or they could catch themselves when they do fall.
Yeah.
And having more muscle is the organ of health. I mean, I don't like to paint with a broad brush, but it is. It's an endocrine organ. It is like a nutrient sink, for lack of a better term. If you have more muscle mass, it protects you against type 2 diabetes. It protects you against a lot of these diseases of excess metabolites because muscle is very greedy and will pull these things out of the bloodstream. I mean, again, I'm painting with a really broad brush here.
Yeah.
But yeah, if we look at, the risk of sarcopenia, which is the progressive loss of muscle mass after age 40 is when they show that sarcopenia begins to start in most people. Protein can help reduce the risk of that. And again, we get focused on longevity, but me personally, I don't want to live to be 100 if my last 30 years are sucky. If they're in a wheelchair or I need a walker or whatever, and I can't get around. I was watching they had a World War II, one of the last World War II veterans on a ship getting an award. And the guy, he's got a cane, but he's up there, he's walking around, he's moving like, that's what if I make it to 100, I want to be like that. Yeah. And my friend Peter Attia describes it as, your quality of life. You want your longevity is going to be, however long it is until you hit the end. but you want their quality of life to basically kind of stay flat and then drop off a cliff real quick when you die, right? But yeah, I think that, and for people out there, protein helps, but resistance training is the best thing you can do. Resistance training is amazing. You're never too old to build muscle. There are studies showing that even like at age 80, if you resistance train, you can build significant muscle and improve your quality of life. It's probably the best thing that you can do. So we should be focused on quality or lifespan, but also quality of life.
Yeah, and I call it a health span. So basically, I agree with you. There is no sense to live to 100, but lie on the bed for 20 years and do nothing. I want at the age of 100 to play with my grandchildren, climb on a mountain. I don't know. For you, is lifting weight. I assume whatever you like to do. Continue to do what you like to do. And another point that I want to add is your point about fall and muscle. So it's that there is another interesting data point that showed that people above the age of 65 that fall and break the hip, they on average have like 6 or 7 months to live. And the reason for that is that most of them has a sarcopenia and they are fragile. So they're basically, it's very hard for them to recover from that. But if you are stronger and you have enough muscle around the hip, and even if you will fall, I agree with you, your balance is better, you most likely not fall. But even if you fall, the muscle will protect the hip. So there is so much advantages of doing strength training, and basically you are one of the experts on that, from being a professional weightlifter to working on that. So absolutely, I think that muscle building is important. And I have a follow-up question to you about that. Does it make sense for a person that is not lifting weight every day, like myself? I'm doing it a few times a week. Should I consume different amount of a protein at the day that I'm lifting, whether the day that I'm not lifting?
That's a great question. I would say we don't have a clear answer in the research literature, but I could speculate based on what I know about protein metabolism. So if you look at the time course of muscle remodeling in response to resistance training, especially in people who are beginners or novices, it's a pretty long time course. Over several days, muscle remodeling happens. And muscle protein synthesis stays elevated for several days. So in that, I think, that'd be hard to argue that consuming more protein on those days you aren't lifting is still a good idea. Now, as people get more advanced, the duration of muscle protein synthesis in response to a resistance training session actually gets shorter. But again, people who are more advanced, if they want to progress, are probably going to need more frequent resistance training sessions. So by default, they're probably going to still be consuming protein on those days. So I don't think you need to kind of bracket your protein around when you train. I think you can just consume the same amount every day.
Yeah. And what about the window? There are some people that saying, hey, you have a window of 2 hours. If you miss the window, that's it. What is your response to that?
Yeah, I think that came out of protein companies who wanted to sell you whey protein supplements. Now whey protein is a great protein, high quality, probably the highest quality protein out there. It's inexpensive for the most part, tastes good, very good amino acid quality, very digestible. But you don't need to take in protein powder. You can get protein from whole food. That's fine. Yeah. And so they kind of wanted to come up with a reason as to why you need protein. And the idea was, well, if you lift and you break down muscle tissue, you want to get anabolic as quickly as possible. So you want a really fast digesting protein source to do that. And the research literature has kind of shown that it's probably a good idea to have protein after your resistance train, but it is not this very narrow window. It's not, you don't have to get it in that fast to get results. It's, instead of thinking it like a window, think of it like a couple of big double doors. It's pretty wide. What I will say is, it's probably a good idea to have protein before you resistance train. It's probably a good idea to have it afterwards. But that can be several hours before and several hours after. I mean, if you eat a meal high in protein, you're going to have amino acids in your bloodstream for several hours. It's not a very quick effect. If you're one of these people who eats an hour before you train, you eat immediately after, let's say your training session was even 2 hours. I mean, you still haven't, if you're eating a meal of say 30 grams of protein, your body still hasn't really gone through all those amino acids in your bloodstream. They're still very well elevated. So no, I don't think you need to eat immediately after your workout. I don't think it's that sensitive. I do think it's a good idea to eat some protein before and some protein after, but that can just kind of fall in your natural meal progression, right? Like if you train in the mornings, you can get up, eat your breakfast, wait a bit, depending on your schedule, right? Like obviously if you have a job you have to be to by 8 or 9 o'clock, then you've got to slam something down real quick and get to the gym. But you can eat your breakfast, train, and then just eat lunch, or if you train in the afternoons, eat lunch, train, eat dinner. It's not, you don't have to be so sensitive. It's not that narrow of a window.
And it sounds like, from what I'm understanding from you, it's better to make it even over the day and not to have you said, let's say you consume 200 grams of protein. It doesn't make sense for you to consume all of it in one batch.
Yeah, I've kind of changed my thinking on this a little bit. I wouldn't say I've totally changed it. I think that the distribution of protein matters. I think it matters much less than getting the overall amount in per day. Okay, so most important thing, getting the total amount of protein in over the course of a day. And we did have a new study come out from Van Loon's lab that showed that basically that your body isn't as wasteful with protein as we thought it was. And we do have some studies looking at intermittent fasting and resistance training showing that, people who intermittent fast, that they can still gain similar amounts of muscle as people who eat, regular spaced meals. I think the important thing to point out in those Tinsley studies is that they were an 8-hour feeding window. They trained in their feeding window, not outside of it. And they consumed 3 high protein meals in that 8-hour feeding window. And so that, some intermittent fasting studies do show muscle loss or loss of lean mass with intermittent fasting. And if we look at the mechanistic data, if we look at the tightly confined data, we know muscle protein synthesis caps out beyond a certain point, right? Like once you get to a certain amount of protein, just pumping more in is not going to increase the amplitude or the duration of muscle protein synthesis. And that means you can't make up for low protein at one meal by eating a ton of it at another meal. Now we don't know what's happening with protein degradation. Protein degradation is a lot more difficult to measure. Protein metabolism scientists, we're getting better ways to measure it, but essentially, if you're trying to measure net protein balance, synthesis, or degradation, it's almost impossible to measure all 3 of those at the same time. It's like you only can get 2 out of the 3 usually. And a lot of times it's really invasive and you have very tight constraints on what you can do in terms of treatment in order to maintain the body in a steady state where you can actually do the mathematics that are required to calculate protein synthesis and degradation. So all that being said, my research on protein, now this was in lab rats, so this is important to point out, but I will say everything that we showed got validated in humans later. And the rodent is actually specifically for protein metabolism a very good model. But again, we've got to take it with a grain of salt. But we had animals for 11 weeks eating either basically evenly distributed protein intake across 3 meals, or 70% of it at dinner, 15% at lunch, 15% at breakfast. And after 11 weeks, we showed about a 5 to 10% difference in the size of the hind limbs of those lab animals. Now, it's important to point out, I weighed out every single meal for 110 lab rats 3 times a day, every day, right? I made all these diets myself. This was a very tightly controlled study, and we only saw this small difference, okay? And when you're talking about humans and free living, it becomes much messier, So I think that's why you probably don't see a lot of differences in distribution studies in humans. The other thing to keep in mind is 10 weeks in a human is a very short period of time. 10 weeks in a lab rat is a significant period of their life because they only live 2 years. Their rates of muscle tissue turnover are much faster than humans. It's about 2 to 4 times as fast. So what I will say is, again, total protein intake, most important. That's the most important. I do think distribution matters. I think that it's hard to pick out human studies in the limited time frame we have and with the apparatus we have. And if you're somebody who's just interested in building some muscle, Do I think you need to get really granular with how you distribute your protein? Probably not. Just, eat multiple high quality protein meals per day. But if you're somebody who's interested in being the most muscular person you could possibly be, like me, then yeah, I'm going to distribute my protein evenly over like 3 to 5 meals per day.
Makes sense. Thank you for the clarification. That's a very good point. And I want to continue to talk about resistant training and specifically for people above the age of 50 that want to build or maintain muscle. And as we said, we know that it's very important to build and maintain muscle. So what is your recommendation? What is the minimum amount of a time that they should spend in a gym lifting weights?
Oh man, minimum effective dose for somebody who's never trained before is very, very low. I mean, you could probably see noticeable results with one hard set per body part per week if you've never done it before. It's not going to be optimal. You can get better results by doing more, but the minimum effective dose is going to basically be, one hard set per week for a body part. And the research actually shows, now if you push that out a little bit in terms of dose response, the research actually shows that, for example, women and older people actually gain a similar amount of muscle as young males as a proportion of their starting lean mass. So what does that mean? Well, if you look at somebody who starts and they have 70 kilos of lean mass versus somebody who starts and has 50 kilos of lean mass, let's say they both increase their lean mass by 10%. The relative change was the same, but one person gained 7 kilos and the other person gained 5 kilos. There's an absolute difference, but the relative is the same. And so the research suggests that based on your starting lean mass, you still respond in a similar fashion to young males filled with testosterone, right? So your cap is going to be different. Your total top end is going to be different if you're a female or you're elderly, because if you're elderly and you have resistance trained, you've already lost lean mass. But you can absolutely gain significant lean mass. And I would say, my general recommendation for people, hey, if you just want to get some of the longevity benefits and build some muscle and be stronger and get quality of life, you're probably going to get 80, 90% of the benefits just doing like 30 to 45 minutes 2 to 3 times a week. If you are pushing yourself, if you are doing hard sets for your body. Now, we do know that based on your genetic differences, think about intensity. And when I say intensity, it means how close to failure that you're taking a set. We know that you want to get within a few reps of failure if you truly want to stimulate muscle growth. Intensity is the drug. The number of hard sets is the dosage. Now, people who are less genetically inclined to build muscle, they still respond to resistance training, but to get a similar result to somebody with better genetics, they need a higher dose. They need more hard sets. So again, a lot of this is, there is some nuance here with genetic differences, but anybody can build muscle. There are no non-responders to resistance training. Just some people may require a little bit higher dose.
Yeah. And it's a good point what you say. It's not enough to go to the gym and show your nice gym clothes. You need to move your muscle and get it to a point that you almost fail. And that's when you... So don't count the minute when you get into the gym and sit in the cafeteria and drink coffee. That's not the time that you are exercising.
Right.
Yeah, and that's taking me to a next point that I think that's very important, and I'm not sure that everyone pay enough attention for that, and that's basically recovery and sleep. We live in a world that we are spending a lot of time on Netflix and social media and all of that, and at the end of the day, we are not allowing our body to relax and sleep and establish itself. So can you discuss that a bit, and what is in your world, and maybe a bit about yourself? How do you recover, and what do you do to recover?
Yeah, so recovery is a few different things. In terms of the major levers to recover, obviously sleep is important. Now, sleep can be individual, but the research data I've looked at, it's funny. If you look at the cohort data, the research says like 7 hours is kind of optimal for longevity and prevention of various, non-communicable diseases. And in fact, that effect seems to be very, very consistent. 7 hours appears to be So kind of like 7 to 8 hours, kind of the sweet spot.
Yeah.
And below that, yes, you have increased risk of disease, but actually above that, you actually have more increased risk. So going from 8 to 9 hours is a bigger increase of risk of mortality than going from 7 to 6 hours, which a lot of people don't realize. They think the more sleep, the better. And here's where I think, sleep is kind of individual. I know for me, if I get 7 hours consistently, I feel very rested. I feel good. I don't need 7.5. I don't need 8 hours. 7 hours is good for me. Now, the other side of that is if you're getting in bed, you're probably going to need to subtract about an hour of you being in bed because you do wake up during the night without realizing it. And there's some sleep latency where it takes you time to fall asleep. So if you're laying in bed for 8 hours, usually you're going to sleep for, 7, maybe a little more. But if you feel rested, people wear these smart watches, they wear rings, they wear all the, and in research studies, and those things are fine. I mean, I think you can get some interesting data from it. But the best predictor of good sleep is how do you feel when you wake up? Do you feel rested? Subjectively, do you feel rested? It is the most reliable marker of good sleep. So, hey, if you feel rested at 6.5 hours, you feel good, and your body is waking you up naturally, that's probably enough for you. But yeah, sleep is obviously a big thing for recovery. Psychological stress management, that's another big one. People don't realize stress is stress, even if it's physical versus psychological. In fact, it's pretty wild when you look at the pain research data. People who have more stress are way more sensitive to pain. If you are somebody who has more psychological stress, your threshold for experiencing pain is much, much lower. And also your risk of injury is higher and your risk of autoimmune diseases is higher. There's a linear effect of stress on autoimmune diseases. Same thing for cardiovascular disease, cancer, mortality. Psychological stress is the one that nobody really wants to talk about because it's tough to manage. Even I have difficulty with it sometimes. But I will say, there are some things you can do that are kind of quote unquote easy things. I'm obviously, if a loved one dies, you're going through a divorce. There are very real things in life that happen where, you're just going to be stressed. You lose a job, you're sick. But if you're watching the news 24/7 and you're getting spun up about every single negative story that comes out, you're inflicting stress on yourself. If you're watching a bunch of murder shows all the time, I didn't realize that this was a thing. And there's people out there who, that's all they watch. They love serial killer dramas and they're looking around every corner that somebody's going to kill them. I mean, you're kind of doing this to yourself a little bit. And so I think there are some things you can do. For example, I've kind of gotten off social media. I have other people do my posting just because I realized I wasn't serving my life very well. I still do the content, but I'm not the one who's on, Instagram or whatnot, posting it. But even when I was on there, if I was following an account that I found okay, this is causing me more stress or this is problematic, I just unfollow. I can curate my own content, and I think a lot of people, they, especially in politics, news, people say, well, it's the media's fault. They show us negative stories. I promise you, if positive stories got more eyeballs than negative stories, the news cycle would change in 3 months because they don't care if it's a positive or negative story. They only care about, are you watching? But negative stories get more eyeballs because it evokes more of an emotional response. And that's what they want. They want an emotional response. They want you sucked in. You can pull the plug on all that. So I don't watch the news. If I want to know the news, there's a few sites I go to that are truly unbiased, or they'll give you all different sides of an issue. I read that and then I go on my merry way. And then I also realize hey, if there's a thermonuclear war tomorrow, I have absolutely no control over that. So I'm going to assume that I'm not going to assume that the world is going to end. I'm going to assume that the world is going to keep on spinning until it doesn't. And if you are somebody who easily gets spun up on that stuff, you got to turn it off. You got to turn it off. I mean, that's easy stuff that you can do. Spending time with friends, that's good for your mental health. People who make you feel good, having appropriate boundaries with people. As weird as that sounds, I know it's therapy speak, but you can control how people treat you and their access to you. And so, this is hard with family members and people we feel like we owe something to. But you got to decide where your hard line is of when you're no longer going to tolerate something. And being around people, it's hard to feel, my opinion is it's hard to feel depressed if you are spending time with people who care about you and they care about you. And you're doing that a lot. I think it's hard to feel depressed when you're like that. So yeah, I think, spending time with people who care about you, doing things that you enjoy, hobbies, that all helps with stress management. And that's a big part of recovery. And then of course, proper nutrition, getting enough protein in, enough high quality food, enough calories. That's also obviously a big thing. And then finally, load management. If you are consistently over the course of weeks and months noticing declines in your performance, you're overly sore, you're not having a lot of motivation to train, you're having trouble sleeping, probably time to back off your volume, at least for a period of time, and allow your body to recover and then try to walk it back up.
Yeah. Yeah, Elaine, a lot of an amazing points that you raise. I really like it. And I think that the social circle is very important and we are not paying enough attention. And you nail it very well. Basically, in social media, try not to be there. If you are there, follow people that make you happy. Don't follow people that make you sad and miserable.
Exactly.
And the same in your social network, your friends. If you have a friend that always, when you meet with them, you feel bad, don't be their friend. Find a friend that every time that you are spending time with them, make you better and not make you worse. So that's very important, and we are not paying enough attention to that. So thank you so much for that. And I want to ask you maybe a personal question about what do you specifically do related to biomarkers, wearable data, tracking tool, basically to guide your training, recovery, and nutrition?
The most important thing is subjectively how you feel, as weird as that sounds. Your subjective feelings. We haven't found anything really, to my knowledge, wearable yet that can accurately predict how well recovered you are. I'll give an example. This isn't exactly what you asked, but I think it's a good example. This watch will tell me how many calories I burned during exercise. The research has shown that they are not accurate. Now, that being said, if normally my watch says I burn about 1,000 calories per hour when I'm training, if I have a day where it says I burn 1,300, the likelihood is I did burn more. I just don't know how many it was, right? If I'm tracking my sleep and it says I got better sleep quality on average than I did last time, it's probably relatively accurate. But I am not going to be slave to any of that data. For example, and I also keep, I use a bar velocity device, which basically shows me how fast I'm moving the barbell. And that's kind of objective data for me to know, like, okay, I seem to be doing better today. I can maybe use a little bit more load, a little more volume, but I'm not going to be slave to that. If I have a rep that comes out slower and I'm like, oh, I actually feel really good. I may not end up reducing my load just because of that, one bad marker. Same token, if I'm feeling like crap and I have a rep that says it's faster, I'm probably going to take in all of how I feel, not just be slave to the markers. And what can happen is the tail can start wagging the dog too. And what I mean by that is you wake up and maybe you actually did sleep okay, but your watch or your ring tells you that you didn't sleep well. Now you feel bad. You're like, oh, well, I'm not going to have a good gym session, or I'm not going to be that recovered. And guess what happens? You don't, because you've already put yourself in that mental space. So I look at this as, when I get this data, I just kind of look at it as it's just one piece that I'm going to use to make decisions with. I'm not going to be slave to it. So I may get some, like my watch today said I got 5.5 hours of sleep, wasn't that great, but I feel okay. I didn't feel really tired when I woke up. And when I get to the gym, I'll see how I feel. And if I'm moving the weights okay, then we're going to continue with a normal workout. If it's moving slow and I feel like crap, then we'll back it off. But I'm not going to be slave to any one piece of data.
Yeah. So basically, you're using it as an expert assist in a way. It's one data point, but you have a lot of data points, and then your brain will analyze it and decide what is the weight of this specific data point.
Yeah, I'm not going to be slave to any one particular thing.
Makes sense. Great. Thank you so much for that. And one very interesting development that happened in the last few years is the GLP-1 agonist drug, Ozempic, Wegovy, and so on. And we've seen, I think that it's a revolution that's coming. It's might be as big as the AI revolution that we might talk later if we have time for that. And I would love to hear your take about that. How do you see it? What are the benefits? What are the risks? Would you recommend someone to go on those drugs to maintain their body weight?
So, I mean, based on the data we have, the GLP-1 mimetics, actually tirzepatide in particular, GLP-1 and GIP mimetics, so it's two gut hormones. It's the best weight loss tool we've ever come across. I think tirzepatide, the research data suggests, my girlfriend would be better off answering this than I would. She's a nurse practitioner who specializes in this. But I think it's a 20% on average reduction in body weight. We don't have anything out there that on average produces body weight by 20%.
Yeah.
Now, there's been a lot of hand-wringing about thyroid cancer, loss of lean mass, all that kind of stuff. I'm not super concerned. Here's why. The stuff on thyroid cancer, it's in animals in high doses. I don't know how applicable that is for humans. We'll know in time. And then, so that's a maybe. Okay. I'm less worried about a maybe than a absolutely this will reduce your lifespan, which obesity does. Yeah. So let's shoot the alligator closest to the boat. You know what I mean? Like this is more of a pressing issue. We have to prioritize. And then with a loss of lean mass, I know a lot of people have expressed this because in the studies with GLP-1 mimetics, you see about 40%, around 40% of the weight people lose is from lean mass. Now that sounds really bad until you realize in regular old dieting studies and people who aren't exercising, it's very similar. It's about 30 to 40% loss of weight from lean mass. Yeah. So my recommendation would be the same for people who are dieting. Resistance train, exercise, eat a high protein diet. The other thing to keep in mind is people who are on a GLP-1 mimetic, a lot of them, because their appetite is so suppressed, they're not seeking out higher protein foods because those are already more satiating. So they may, again, through unconsciously, actually lower the protein intake. So I think indirectly it could be a concern, but as an independent risk, I'm not concerned about it. I would just say, again, eat a high protein diet, resistance train, and I'm not that worried about it.
Yeah, I agree. And basically, as you said, it's as good, the Lilly compounds are as good as bariatric surgery, but you don't need to do the surgery. Right. And there are so many other benefits that they receive because they become not obese anymore. Less cardiovascular disease, less renal disease, a lot of cancer. They decrease the chance of cancer, even dementia. There are so many positive effects. Yeah, there are some side effects, and there might be some that are not known yet. But the value is so high for that population that I agree with you. No question that I will recommend everyone that is obese or overweight to get on that, and it's a wonderful drug.
Well, and even like with addiction, there's actually research coming out now because the GLP-1s are acting on the hypothalamus. It appears to decrease overall drive for addictive things in general. So, and this is a little bit of anecdotal stuff, but again, my girlfriend, she works as a nurse practitioner at a longevity clinic, and she's noticed people who were alcoholics or had other addictions, gambling, pornography, that they actually have less drive for those things anymore. It appears to affect the reward center of the brain kind of in general. And so it's decreasing that kind of reward so that you're not seeking it out as much. So we may end up discovering, and I don't know if the research is out there yet, I think there is some research on this, but we may discover that this has much more broad sweeping benefits than we once thought as maybe even a possible treatment for addiction. Yeah. So again, like there's no drug out there that doesn't have side effects. So let's, people who are like bringing some of this stuff up. Yeah, I don't think any of people who are recommending GLP-1s are saying, yeah, it's absolutely safe. There's no negative side effects. You don't have to worry about it. Of course there's side effects. It's a drug. But if we're looking on balance, if I get an obese person lose 20% of their body weight and keep it off, Oh yeah, I'm gonna take that over most of any potential side effects for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one more question that I would like to ask you is about supplementation and anything that you are taking or recommending people to take in context of increasing health span and lifespan.
Creatine monohydrate, as you know, like there's a ton of. I'm sure you're familiar with it, Gil. There is a ton
Of
of
course, yeah,
research coming out
yeah,
now that shows that creatine is not just good for muscle health, but it may be actually a very reasonable treatment for depression, cognitive decline. There's a lot of research now on creatine showing that it can improve cognition, memory, cognitive function. And there was a study that just came out looking at people who had severe to moderate to severe depression, and it's on a scale. I'm going to try to remember the raw numbers, but essentially, so I think their average score was like a 17.5, which is severe to moderate on the scale of depression. And the group that was getting just CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, their numbers dropped, I think, to like 11 or 12, which is a good decline. The group getting creatine plus CBT, so they were getting therapy and creatine monohydrate 5 grams per day, dropped to 6. So they went from moderate to severe depression to mild, almost no depressive symptoms. That is incredible. And I think that was I want to say less than 12 weeks. Wow. So I find it, you're going to have a very hard time making an argument for me why everyone should not be taking creatine monohydrate at this point, because of the benefits on body composition, strength, performance, and cognition. So that's one of my number one supplements. There are others. I think a lot of people are going to be pretty low in vitamin D. I think vitamin D is a pretty quote unquote easy thing to add in and help you shore up. So vitamin D appears to have a pretty broad, sweeping, beneficial effect on health. There's some other things, in terms of, and again, I'm going to shout out my girlfriend because she put me onto this, but red yeast rice, something like that. I might be saying it the wrong way, but that can drop LDL cholesterol, improve blood lipids. A lot of this, berberine, a lot of the stuff on it is overblown in terms of the effect size, but it does appear to reliably increase insulin sensitivity. So, there are some things out there that do appear to help people. My list isn't exhaustive. I think whey protein is another great supplement. If you have trouble getting enough, high quality protein, I think whey protein is a great supplement. So those would be some of the ones on my list.
And talking about whey protein, it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that most of us are not getting the right amount. I'm talking about normal person, but a person that lift. So it's very hard for, you said 200 or 300 grams a day. It's very hard to get 200 or 300 grams a day just by eating chicken and eggs. You need to eat a lot of chicken and eggs.
For sure. And then if you look at the elderly population, they have more trouble with mastication, with chewing.
Yeah.
And so, they don't eat as much meat, and it's harder for them to get that in. So in that particular population, again, like a protein powder or a protein shake may be, a better alternative. They wouldn't be able to get the protein in if they didn't have it.
And definitely it's much better than commercialized food that come from a packet, the industrial food. So take the whey protein 10 times better than eating pretzels or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And we touched it a few minutes ago about the AI revolution. And I'm wondering, how do you see that in the health and wellness domain, especially to drive nutrition and exercise recommendation? Do you see a big room for that, or small, or what is your vision for that?
That's above my pay grade. I don't know enough about AI, to be quite honest with you. I think that I've seen it be a useful tool in like research for data mining. I'm a scientific advisor for a company called Consensus, which is basically like PubMed combined with ChatGPT. So you ask it a research question and it will give you kind of the consensus answer from the scientific research, and then it can give you more detailed breakdowns based on what you're looking for. I think that's useful. I think it's going to be useful for doing like large scale computations and modeling much faster than we traditionally have done it. So I do think it's going to play a major role. I'm just not sure what it's going to look like just yet.
Yeah, no, that's fair. It's we are in the beginning of the revolution, and it's very hard to predict the future. So, if you could give one science-backed piece of advice for yourself at the age of 25, and one at the future advice at the age of 75, what would you do?
Oh man,
What would you say?
25. For health. Honestly, the biggest health advice I'd give myself is for mental health, because I was doing a lot of the things right for actual health. I would say, stop trying to please everybody and focus on what's important to you. Because I stayed in a lot of friendships, quote unquote friendships, business relationships, personal relationships that I shouldn't have. I should have ended them before I did, and it caused me a lot of stress, a lot of pain, and that was not necessary. So I think if I had learned that it was okay to prioritize myself a little bit more, it would have had to a better an outcome. As far as my future self, I don't know what I would say. Sorry for the trouble. I would probably say, hopefully over the next however many years, over the next, you said 75, over the next 32 years, I consistently do things in alignment with who I want to be as a person and, the things I want to accomplish. And I hope my actions are in alignment with that. And I think I probably didn't. I've had this conversation a lot, but I think I'm somebody who I never slow down. I am, in fact, so I was telling a friend of mine, we were talking, he had been on a seminar tour with me in Australia like a decade ago. And he saw me kind of how I operated, traveling from city to city, doing seminars, still keeping up with coaching, training. And he said, man, you've got a motor on you like nobody I've ever met. You never stop. But I think that also has not served me very well, because when it came time to, making certain decisions in my life, I didn't slow down enough to ask myself what was really important to me. I just kind of plowed ahead. And that has been actually the source of a lot of the problems in my life, is not slowing down. And, I ended up creating disorganization and chaos that took me a disproportionate amount of time to work through and undo, compared to if I had just slowed down and been more mindful about what I wanted to do. It would have been a lot less painful. So that was, slowing down is the one lesson I still haven't learned and has caused me a significant amount of pain. So I tell my future self, I hope I spent the next 32 years still driving forward, but making smart decisions and slowing down when the time was right.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. And the last question that I always ask our guest is, what is your top tip for health span and longevity for our listeners?
Top tip. Man, it's hard to pick one out, but I would say, I'll just give a couple real quick. Resistance train, move your body. Don't eat too many calories. Eat enough protein and fiber. Limit drinking. I say limit because, drinking is a big part of our culture. And if you can abstain, great. Don't smoke. Get enough sleep. And take care of your mental health, like we were just talking about. You do those 6 things, you're way ahead of the game.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that was great. So I think that we are coming up on our time. And thank you so much, Layne. It was a great discussion, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm sure that our audience will enjoy it as well. And we look forward to exploring the research in the field of longevity each month with you and the leading scientists. For more information, please go to www.instatracker.com/podcast. Again, thank you so much, Layne. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure's all mine. Thank you, Gil.
Thanks for listening to Longevity by Design. Please subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Longevity by Design is powered by Inside Tracker, a personalized health optimization platform that helps people improve their lives by improving their bodies from the inside out, using personalized, science-backed recommendations for nutrition, supplements, and lifestyle changes. To learn more, visit insidetracker.com/podcast.